In the past, if I needed to make a mark on my stock, I used a pencil. I even made a marking gauge that uses a pencil lead to do just that. But there are times you want to actually cut the surface, especially if you're making joints by hand. Today I'm going to show you a marking gauge that uses either a blade or a screw to cut into the wood for those times that you really do want to cut into the fibers. But let me show you how I made this. To get started with this, we need to glue these 4 pieces together. Because these are small pieces and I don't want them to slide around, I'm just going to use a little bit of salt. We'll go ahead and let this dry and we'll come back. At the table saw, we want to raise our blade so that it's about 1/8 of an inch above the top of the table. So it looks like right there. Now I need to make sure that my blade is 1/4 inch away from the fence. And that's 1/4 inch right there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and cut, flip my board over, and cut again. I'm going to do this so that I have 2 grooves. They're 5/32 of an inch. And again, they're going to be 1/4 inch away from the edges. And then I'm going to make that next cut right next to it. And I should be able to fit my 5/16 rod in here without any problems. With both of these done, we're going to go ahead and split this into pieces. With my smaller side over here, I want it to be 3/4 of an inch from right here on over. So I'll carry that section over to the other side, and then I'll transfer that again. And now I'm going to move up 3/4 of an inch. I need to section this bottom piece off. It needs to be 1/2 inch from this line. Finally, with this section, we're going to cut it down to 1 3/4. When we add our square stock, you should have a little bit of a gap on the side. Obviously, we want to be able to clamp this down so this doesn't move. But now we need to focus on drilling our hole in the second block. I could just connect my angles like this, but I really want there to be a positive stop where these blocks come together. I do have a bench anvil that I think is pretty flat, and I'm going to go ahead and reference my 2 pieces with that because I want there to be a really good positive stop. When you're sure you've got it where you want it to be for that positive stop, and we'll take a drill bit and we'll make sure that it's right up against that groove, and I'll add a little mark. And that's what I want to drill out right there. Before I drill this, I'm going to use a clamp because it is a small piece. And I also want to set my drill press so that the point just barely sticks out through the bottom. This is important because later on, after we've added the hole, we still need to make a countersunk hole on the other side. I've got a 5/8 bit in here, which is the size of the head of my bolt. I'm going to bring this down because I only want to go in so far. I'm going to leave it right there at that point. And there we go. It fits in there pretty good. It still needs to be cinched in a little bit more, but it's below the surface, so I'm happy with that. If I'm being perfectly honest, I wish I had another stick of this square stock. I only have 1 stick of 5/16 here. So I went ahead and made a square dowel out of Purple Heart. I did this by making sure that my blade was 5/16 of an inch off the tabletop, as well as 5/16 away from the fence. And then I made my cuts. If you do it right, you'll have this square piece left behind. So as long as I can fit this in here, that would be okay. It looks like it's still going to be difficult. Just means I need to sand this down a little bit. While that is tight in there, I obviously don't want the top part to be tight because I want this to be able to slide easily along here, and that is really stiff. Again, if I had 2 metal pieces, it'd be really easy to slide. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and taper this a little bit. So I'll turn this at a slight angle. Just give it a slight taper. And that's much better. I add this on and I tighten it down. That is not going anywhere. So we're looking good, and now we'll go on to the next part. We've got most of the handle made. We're going to focus now on the bar that slides inside of the handle, and the pin that we use to actually cut marks into our stock. To do this, I'll be using a stainless steel 6/32 bolt. We are going to be using both sides of the bolt, so I'm going to need to remove the head as well as add points to both sides. The points on either side of the bolt will need to be centered, and I'm going to be using a hand drill to do that. I'll start off by cutting the head of this off, and I'm just going to go ahead and chuck this in. I'm going to use a sander to round that point. I'm using stainless steel because it's a little bit harder than regular steel, and since I will be cutting with this, I obviously want to keep this as sharp as I can. And this is what it looks like when we're done. This will be drilled out on the drill press because we need to make sure that it's perfectly straight all the way through. To attach this to our 5/16 rod, we're going to need to use a tap and drill combo. I am using a stainless steel 6/32 bolt, so I'm going to need a 6/32 tap and drill combo. I'm going to use a punch on the top of this to make sure that my drill bit doesn't move across the surface as I'm drilling. And it really doesn't matter where you put this. I think maybe about 1/2 inch in at the least is the best, but we'll center it before we use a hammer to mark it. And it really only takes one hit to get a good mark. I've added my drill bit to my chuck, and you can see that I've got it really high, so that's really deep inside of the chuck. I'm going to do this because I don't want to have any kind of flexing as I'm drilling down. The second thing that I'm going to do to make sure that I drill a hole straight is to make sure that my table is locked and tight. As you unlock your table, because of the weight, it actually drops down a little bit, and we obviously don't want to have that. Stop and add a little bit of oil. Now that I've got this in there just a little ways, I'm gonna make sure that I clamp my stock to make sure, again, that I'm going straight down. I'm gonna release my table now. We'll lower this down. We'll add the tap now. I'll lock this with a down to get it started. We're going to turn till it gets stuck, and then we'll go back, which will break the chips. We'll use some cutting oil. Once I've got this stuck in here, and it is stuck pretty good, I'm going to go ahead and release this. And we'll take this over to the vise. I chuck this up in my vise as I've got a whole lot more leverage to turn this than I do with my chuck. I'm just gonna go enough that I feel it gets stuck, the tap in the steel, and then I'm gonna go backwards. When I go backwards, again, that's gonna be breaking those chips and allowing us to go forward. You wanna take your time with this. If you do this too fast, it'll break your tap and then you're in big trouble. Another problem that you're going to run into is friction, so I'm going to add a little bit more oil to this. Now I'm going to go ahead and take this out, clean out some of those chips, because if they back up, that will also be a problem. I used to always have a problem tapping things. This method does not fail me. But another important thing is to make sure that you always use the right drill bit. So buying that combo pack really helps out to make sure that you get the exact tap that you need and the drill bit. Now that I've gone around a couple times, I'm going to go ahead and clean this out again. One thing you might consider doing before you add that cutter head is to just go ahead and use a regular screw to make sure that those threads are all cleaned out. But there we go. If I back this out a little bit and add a square, looks like I did a pretty good job. I've got this all put together, and I'm going to show you really quickly how this thing works. So you can see I've got both of my rods in here, but if I want to set this, and let's say I want to make a mark at 1/2 inch. If I push the second one up, it has a positive stop right at the top, and that's what we were trying to do earlier. And that's 1/2 inch. I can lock that in place. I'll grab my stock, and I can easily place that mark. If I want to set the other side to make a mortise, I'll hold onto the steel, unlock it, and now I can set this one, and let's say I want to set this at 1 inch. So I've got that at 1 inch, I'll lock it, we'll check it again. So that's at 1 inch. And that is at 1/2 inch. I can come in here and make my 1/2 inch, flip it over, and make my inch. If I measure between the two, I've got my 1/2 inch. This really works and I like it, but the one drawback that I don't like about these kind of cutters is that you really are just scratching the surface. You're not really cutting it. Using a pin to cut is a very old technique. If we look at this mortising jig, you can see it's got the pins just like the one that we made. But the newer ones use a round cutter, which helps to cut the surface instead of just scratching it. If this is all that you're looking for, then you can stop right now. This will work. But let me show you some add-ons to make this just a little better. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and take it apart. And this is the reason why I didn't glue this piece on. I really wanted to make some add-ons. Instead of using the square steel, I'm going to use round stock. I like the round stock better because it's going to be a little bit better for cutting with our round blade. But before I do that, the one thing that I want to do is to make this a little bit more ergonomic. Having a square block like this is not something I want to hold on to with my hands. I'd like to cut the corners off. Again, I have re-linked these together just long enough that I can make this cut. If you want to add the corners, again, just make sure that you cut it before you split it off into pieces. Before I add the epoxy, I'm just going to rough up one side. Gives the epoxy something to stick to. I'll give this some time to cure. We'll come back and we'll keep working on this. The cutter blade that I'll be using is actually something that you would buy for a lathe. So I bought these bits on Amazon. I think I got the set for about $10, which I think it's still 50% off right now if you want to get it. It comes in a pack with all these other pieces, but this is really the only one that we need, this cutter head. The thing that I like about this blade is that because it's used for lathe tools, it's carbide steel instead of just the regular steel that they use in the other marking gauges. So I think that you can get a lot more cutting out of this than you could with something else that you would buy. I've got the rod here that I'll attach it to, and it needs to be attached to the end like this. So we obviously need to drill out that center. I've already done one with a lathe, which really wasn't exactly center like I had hoped, but I've come up with another method that will easily give us a nice direct center hole in our stock. You'll want another block of wood that's 1.5 inches, maybe even a little bit less. I think this is 1 3/8 inches, but we want to have a really nice thick piece of wood that will allow us to drill in halfway with a bit that's the size of our steel, our 3/8 here. And then on the opposite side, it's going to be the hole that we're going to use to actually tap the dowel with. So after this is drilled out, this will fit on like this, and then we drill out the other side. And that will give us a nice, perfect center. So let's go ahead and do that now. One thing that is important is you want to have a vise. You want to have a vise because you want to be able to make sure that as you switch the bits, it's going to be an exact hole all the way through. I'm going to go ahead and put my block on, and it really doesn't even matter if it's like this, as long as, again, I'm making that straight hole. Before I clamp this to the drill table, and it will need to be clamped to the drill table, I'm going to make sure that my bit goes halfway down, and then I'm going to lock it. Another thing that you need to consider is that you need to have that drill bit high enough that you can replace it with a smaller bit later on. Now I'll go ahead and find the approximate center right there. That's good. And I'll lock my table so that there's no sagging. And I'll go ahead and add some clamps to make sure that there's no movement, again, with that vise. Now I can replace the bit. I do have my bit out a little bit longer than I'd like to have it out, but I'm going to go really slow and do a little bit at a time to make sure I'm getting a nice direct hole all the way through. I'll go ahead and slide my bit in until I hit the steel. The screw that's going to go into the end, I'm going to go ahead and put this on the top and then wrap my tape. We'll use this as a depth gauge. What I've learned from this is to make sure to drill a little at a time and clean up as much of the metal dust as you can, removing the block each time. Using oil made this work much better, and if you see more sawdust coming out of the hole than metal shavings, it means you're not straight. Originally I used a quarter drill, but switched to a battery one as it spins slower. And that is not a bad hole right there. It's about as perfect as I'm going to be able to make it with this. And if we compare this to the lathe that I did earlier, you can see that it is much more centered. Now we need to tap this end. Now I can put the cutter head on and we should be good to go. To finish this project, I polished up the steel on the lathe. To fit the carriage bolt in, I cut out the square depth and pulled the bolt in by tightening the thumb knob. I used a plug cutter to cut a 5/8 disc. This disc will hide the carriage bolt. A little epoxy, add the disc, and you'd never know we used a carriage bolt. None of this is really necessary, but it does give it a nicer feel. I've seen a few websites tout their marking gauge's ability to hide the blade, so I used a countersink bit to do that with mine. And that slides in just enough to conceal that blade. To use this, it's going to be the same mechanics we used with the scratching screw that we did much earlier. To set the blade, all you have to do is push this forward. These two pieces will line up, and then we're just going to move this center piece. Let's say I want to make it at 1 inch. Lock it in place. I've got a piece of cherry here, and I've got my inch mark right there. But let's say we want to do a mortise. We'll loosen this up. The only thing that's going to change is this second smaller piece. And let's say I want to go a 1/2 inch down from that. So 1.5 inches plus 1/2 inch. I'm looking at 1.5 inches. Lock that, we'll check it again. We'll measure that. And we've got our 1/2 inch right there. Anyway, that's what I've got for you. If you're interested in this project, I have all the materials used as well as tools used in the description down below. It'll be on my website. Let me know in the comments what you think of this, if this is something that you might make yourself.